Safe, reliable, free, and honest support. Qualities you cannot find online. Until now. Introducing the next generation of online technology support. What technology malfunctions are troubling you? Let us know today on the all-new support forums at www.theapplepost.com.
Welcome to Geek Cross, the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder. Now, normally on Geek Cross, I spend a lot of time talking about pop culture and faith, using science fiction and fantasy and gaming and comic books as a way of talking about deeper issues. But on this episode, I want to talk about something very serious and something that has been at a point where pop culture and faith have collided with each other. As most of you know, over the past month there have been allegations against Josh Duggar, the oldest child of Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar, a family that has spent the last 10 years or so in television, in reality television. What makes this family unique is they have 19 children, and the current version of the show is called 19 and Counting. And the Duggars have represented a kind of conservative Christianity in the media. Now, the allegations against Josh Duggar is that when he was a teenager, about 14 years old or so, he molested 4 of his sisters and a babysitter. And of course, this has completely blown up everywhere. I have some thoughts about the Duggars, and I have some thoughts about this situation and how religious communities have dealt or often deal with sexual molestation and abuse. So I normally don't begin my episodes with a trigger warning, but this one's going to have it. If you are upset about these kinds of issues, about the subject matter, if you are triggered by the subject matter, please do not listen to this. Go take care of yourself. There are plenty of other wonderful podcasts out there, and you don't have to listen, and you don't have to put yourself through this. What makes this story difficult to talk about, other than the obvious fact that it involves sexual abuse, is that there are lots of different angles to approach the story from. I think on one level, it's another sign that conservative Christianity has a serious problem responding to the sexual molestation of children. Many churches and families are simply not equipped to respond in a way that protects victims. What often happens, like with the Duggars, is that church leaders and families attempting to deal with the situation themselves rather than notify authorities. By attempting to respond to sexual violence that is beyond their capacity to deal with, leaders and parents often protect perpetrators and silence victims, regardless of their intentions. In all fairness, this is not simply a problem for just conservative fundamentalist evangelicals. The Catholic priest abuse scandal from a few years ago is an example of a church hierarchy that failed to protect children from pedophile priests because it valued its reputation more than it valued the safety of children. The Mennonite Church USA, where I serve as an ordained pastor, is still dealing with the reverberations of sexual misconduct by the theologian John Howard Yoder, who sexually abused, harassed, and assaulted women for decades, until allegations were finally publicly acknowledged in 1992. What makes the Yoder case so noteworthy is that he is perhaps one of the most significant theologians of the 20th century. His classic, The Politics of Jesus, is a foundational text of modern radical Christian pacifism. And yet, Yoder was also a sexual predator. I don't believe that any organization or institution, religious or otherwise, is completely immune to the risk that someone within the organization is a sexual predator. This includes secular liberal groups. We all have to take precautions to protect children and other vulnerable people who are part of our churches, civic organizations, and families. This is part of the reality we live in, and I believe we have always lived in this reality. The reason why we seem to have more cases today is not because we are more immoral than in the past. It is because we are more open and aware that sexual violence happens, even though it's still taboo to talk about in a lot of contexts. Now, I need to say something here about why I chose to talk about the Duggars and the issue of sexual abuse in religious communities. It's an issue I feel passionate about in both my personal and professional life. One of the reasons why I feel so passionate about this topic and why I'm personally upset and frustrated about the revelations regarding Josh Duggar is that I am married to an incest survivor. My wife Megan was physically, emotionally, and sexually abused by her parents. Like the Duggars, she grew up in a conservative religious home. She was raised Mormon. Like the Duggars, Megan was homeschooled and shielded, actually more like intentionally isolated from the world around her. Like the Duggars, Megan's faith community failed to properly respond when she began to talk about her abuse. Now, Megan gave me permission to talk about her experience. I asked if she'd be willing to come onto Geek Cross and talk about this herself, but she declined. The media coverage about Josh Duggar has been really difficult for her. She has felt triggered by it, and so as part of her own self-care, has decided not to talk about this publicly. I support this decision. I want to make it clear that I do not speak for Megan. Our hope is that her experience can be a bit of a resource for people to understand the seriousness of what has happened here with the Duggars. In June 2008, Megan gave a sermon at the North Baltimore Mennonite Church about her experience. I was in seminary at the time, but not yet in pastoral ministry. Megan has given me permission to share parts of her sermon with you. Megan's sermon was called Answering the Cry of Tamar, and she based it on 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 1 through 22. Now, the story of Tamar is one of those Game of Thrones-esque stories in the Bible, where horrible things happen to someone without power or even voice. That those who have power at the top of the hierarchy, at the top of society, victimize and take advantage of those at the bottom. The story of Tamar that Megan drew from is a story about rape, and it is a story about silence. King David's eldest son, Amnon, falls in love with his half-sister Tamar. As Scripture puts it, quote, Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her, unquote. Now Amnon has his friend named Jonadab, who notices that something is bothering and asks him about it. And when Amnon admits his desire for Tamar, Jonadab presents him with a plan. He tells him, go to bed and pretend to be ill, and ask King David to send Tamar with food. So Tamar goes to Amnon and prepares the food. However, when she tries to feed him, Amnon refuses to eat and orders all of his servants to leave him and Tamar alone. Once they're alone, Amnon asks Tamar to serve the food in his bedroom. And when she does, Amnon grabs her and says, come to bed with me, my sister. Tamar protests. She begs Amnon not to rape her, that it's wicked and will disgrace her and turn him into a fool. She even begs Amnon to go to the king and request marriage, just so that he won't carry through with this. Amnon ignores her. Amnon overpowers Tamar and rapes her. And after the rape, Amnon is now so disgusted by her that he orders Tamar to leave his room. And Tamar begs him not to throw her out. She knows the shame and stigma that she now faces in her community. So Amnon orders a servant to throw her out and lock the door. Tamar tears the robe she is wearing and puts ashes on her forehead, a sign of mourning, and she leaves weeping. Later, Tamar's brother Absalom asks her directly about Amnon. And we don't know Tamar's answer, but we do know Absalom's response. Quote, be quiet for now, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart. And the last that we hear of Tamar in the scriptures is that she went to live in Absalom's house, a desolate woman. I've thought about the story of Tamar, as I've read and watched and listened to the allegations and the defenses of Josh Duggar. And while this is not an easy story, it does illustrate what often happens in sexual abuse cases. As Megan said in her sermon, quote, "Sadly, the story of Tamar is similar to the many stories of sexual abuse that happen today. Tamar was sexually assaulted not by a stranger, but by someone that she knew and presumably trusted. The assault happened in a familiar setting, in her case, a home. Tamar said no, and her no was not respected. When Tamar sought help, she was told to keep silent, to stifle her feelings. She is also met with an attempt to minimize Amnon's horrible actions. We're not given any evidence that she was consoled or affirmed. Tamar never gets to demand justice for what happened to her. Rather, she lives in Absalom's house, socially abandoned, psychologically traumatized, and denied a life detached from the assault. Desolate." Unquote. One of the things that struck me about the interviews that Megyn Kelly at Fox News did with the Duggars was how both the parents, Jim Bob and Michelle, as well as a couple of Josh's victims, Jill and Jessa, minimized what had happened. They said things like, "It wasn't that bad. It's not like it was rape. The girls were asleep and didn't know what happened. Josh only touched the girls outside of their pants, except for the times he touched them under their pants, and then only for a few seconds, and then he told us about it. It happens in other families too. It happened a long time ago. We've forgiven Josh. The media revealing the molestation is worse than the molestation itself." These are all statements that try to minimize what happened. I find it strange that the Duggars attempt to portray their daughters as barely victims. I find it strange that the Duggars attempt to characterize Josh's molestation of his sisters as the acts of a horny teenage boy run amok. As Libby Ann on the Lovejoy Feminism blog on Pathos points out, some, quote, "sexual things are normal for a teen to do, say masturbating. But other sexual things are not typical behavior, say molesting children," unquote. What Josh did wasn't normal. By the Duggars' own admission, Josh confessed 3 times before his parents tried to get him help. He was crying out for help, but since the Duggars wanted to first deal with these issues in-house, help never came. Jim Bob and Michelle did not call the police. They did not send Josh to treatment with a licensed therapist. According to news reports, the Duggars waited 16 months before they sought any professional help for their children. And Josh apparently never got professional help, but was sent away 4 months to do labor. That is not treatment. So after an anonymous tip reported the Duggars, police did investigate. But according to the news, they did not charge Josh because the statute of limitations had expired. And as some commentators point out, if the statute of limitations had not expired, Jim Bob and Michelle themselves could face charges under Arkansas law for permitting abuse of a minor. One defense about the Duggars I've heard is that they tried to do the best they knew how. They did the best they could to protect the girls from Josh, which in some ways is probably true, but still, that's not good enough. These girls still lived in the same house with their perpetrator. Other families that Josh came into contact with weren't warned. Josh never got effective treatment. This is not a sufficient response to sexual abuse. And yet, I honestly believe that the Duggars were not equipped to handle these incidents, the situation, any better than they did. Here's the thing. Sexual violence is not really about sex. Sexual violence is usually about power, exercising power over another person. Sex is just a means to exercise power over another person. What makes it even more complicated in a conservative Christian context is that when sexual violence is committed by those with power, the reason they have power is because of God. The Duggars are the media face of a particular evangelical Christian subculture that I would characterize as an extreme. And while the Duggars themselves do not self-identify with the Quiverfull movement, their theology is similar. And for those of you who don't know what Quiverfull is, basically, Quiverfull is a conservative fundamentalist movement that believes families should trust God with their family planning. In other words, couples that are part of this movement do not practice any form of birth control, since children are seen as a blessing from God. Along with lots of children, Quiverfull families are often characterized by patriarchal family structures, where the husband is the head of the family, a belief that teenage children should find partners or mates through courtship instead of dating, rigid gender roles, and homeschooling to shelter children from outside secular influences. The name Quiverfull comes from Psalm 127, 3-5. Quote, "Sons are indeed a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a young warrior are the sons of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate." Christian children, then, are the arrows that fill the quiver of their Christian parents, hence Quiverfull. The imagery in Psalm 127 of children as weapons, as arrows, does carry with it an implication that those who are part of the Quiverfull movement are at war with society around them, a society they see as increasingly godless as it becomes more secular and moves away from quote-unquote traditional patriarchal family structures. This is a war of demographics, where families try to create as many Christian children as possible. I view it as a kind of bedroom evangelism. While the Duggars don't identify themselves with the Quiverfull movement, they do have strong connections with a conservative Christian minister named Bill Gothard. Gothard is primarily known as the founder and former president of the Institute in Basic Life Principles, which tries to teach people to find success in life by following biblical teaching. Gothard came to prominence in the 1970s by hosting seminars that emphasized respect for authority and biblical faithfulness as keys to success. However, Gothard stepped down in 2014 after revelations of sexual misconduct and harassment were made public. One of the reasons why my wife was abused by her parents for so long, and the reason why nobody did anything about it, was because she was at the bottom of the social hierarchy. A hierarchy that was established and maintained through the use of scripture and holy texts and theology that assigned authority to others over her on the mere basis of their gender. As a female child, Megan had no power and no agency to prevent her parents from abusing her. As a child, Megan had no power, no agency when those with authority refused to listen to her. In her sermon, Megan talked about trying to talk with church leaders about her experiences. Quote, "At best, I was met with awkwardness and silence. I also received such responses as, 'You try to be more obedient, this will stop.' The worst one was from a bishop who told me that I was lying because my father was my priesthood holder and I am just his female child." However, the truly horrifying part about the responses I received is that they are no way unique to my situation or the denomination that I grew up in, but rather these responses are all too common, leaving victims feeling betrayed and abandoned by God." Unquote. With the Duggars, we once again see a case where the primary concern on social media is for the perpetrators, not the victims. In their response to Josh's actions, the Duggars protected Josh from consequences while leaving his victims at risk, even though they locked bedroom doors. And as they themselves confess, the situation with Josh did escalate. It did get worse. In the kind of theological and social framework that the Duggars represent, boys are privileged over girls. Sons are privileged over their sisters. Therefore, Josh is given the benefit of the doubt. Once again, the victims of sexual violence are sidelined and marginalized. Therefore, social media defends Josh and expresses over whether he is being unfairly punished for something that a stupid teenager did a long time ago. Again, most stupid teenagers don't molest their sisters. One of the questions that I've been struggling with is why? Why all this support for Josh and the Duggars? It's important to note that both the Quiverfull movement and Bill Gothard are controversial among evangelicals. They represent extremes. And one of the things that I think a lot of people outside of conservative Christianity forget is that not all conservatives or fundamentalists or evangelicals believe the same things. There is a spectrum of belief. Quiverfull, Bill Gothard, and the Duggars are on the hard far right of the spectrum. And yet, moderate conservative evangelicals make up a huge part of the Duggars television audience, and many of them defend the Duggars from criticism. One of the themes that I've seen on Facebook and Twitter is that while Josh did something that was really bad and we don't defend it, the reasons that the Duggars are being attacked is that people hate them. And the reason why people hate them is because they're Christians. And the reason why TLC pulled 19 County off the air is because of Christian persecution. Why is this? While many evangelicals might support and praise the Duggars as a depiction of traditional family and moral wholesomeness, often their own family relationships don't reflect that same extreme. While there are, of course, exceptions, many mainstream evangelicals, in my experience, have more egalitarian marriages than the Duggars. Most evangelicals don't support the Duggars' extreme views on courtship or on rigid gender roles. I think for many evangelicals, the Duggars represent a positive depiction of faith in a media landscape that is often hostile to religion, and they represent a positive morality when reality television often shows the worst that humanity has to offer. One of the things that I've heard conservatives quote in regards to modesty and righteous living is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 22, where the Apostle Paul writes, "Avoid the appearance of evil." I think the Duggars, for many evangelicals, and the kind of wholesome life they appeared to lead, represented the avoidance of the appearance of evil, especially when compared to a lot of other things in the media landscape. Reality television is more about fantasy and wish fulfillment than reality, whether it's the wealthy, high-powered Hollywood life of the Kardashians or the homespun wholesomeness of the Duggars. The Duggars gave life to the thought, to the fantasy that perhaps it was possible to raise 19 well-adjusted children. Perhaps that it was possible to live this fantasy life of a traditional Christian moral life that doesn't really seem to exist anymore. Perhaps then, the avoidance of the appearance of evil is not enough. Perhaps we need something beyond the carefully crafted image of reality television. In her sermon, Megan called on the church to break its silence on sexual abuse and to name it a sin. Not a sin of lust, that the way the Duggars defined it, but rather what Megan called a multidimensional sin that affects a victim's relationship to self, community, and God. As Megan preached, sexual abuse is a bodily sin. That sexual abuse violates the body integrity of the victim, resulting in lifelong body-related issues. It is a relational sin. That sexual abuse violates trust, destroying any possibility of a healthy relationship between the victim and the perpetrator, and also creating trust issues in all current and future relationships. It is a social sin. Sexual abuse is sustained through secrets and silence from the victim, the perpetrator, and the community in which it happens. It is a sexual sin that distorts and misuses sexuality, changing the victim's ability to accept and express their sexuality long after the abuse has ended. And it is a spiritual sin. In Genesis 1:27, it states that God created male and female in God's image. Acts of sexual abuse deny the sacredness of another human being, affecting the very core of the victim's identity and relationship to God. Churches are then in a unique position to respond to sexual abuse because they often represent an expression of God on earth. As Megan preached, quote, "We tie our experiences and relationships with the faith community to our personal relationships with God. Therefore, how we as a faith community respond to pain and brokenness can and often has a profound impact on a person's faith. When it comes to responding to sexual abuse, the church can have profound and extreme impact on both ends of the spectrum, depending on how we choose to react. On one end, our response can bring about justice, healing, and a new life for the victim, in addition to accountability, repentance, and rehabilitation of the perpetrator. On the other end of the spectrum, our response can compound the spiritual and identity issues that the abuse already caused, resulting in a spiritual death for the victim, alienation from God and the faith community. Additionally, our response can enable the perpetrator to victimize again and again." Unquote. I've been blessed in the past 4 years of ministry that I've never had to directly deal with the issue of sexual molestation. I have been blessed that I have not had a situation where it blew up in my own congregation. But even though I have not dealt with it directly, I am also aware that statistically there are survivors in my congregation, and so one of the things that I'm always on the lookout for is whether or not there are untold stories, whether or not there is silence about things that may have happened. There are a number of organizations that can help out with coming up with a policy, but any kind of policy that any kind of church or organization needs to have at least 2 components. One component is prevention, to prevent this from happening. And the other component is, because no policy is perfect and it is impossible to prevent all bad things from happening, to have a way of reporting, a procedure, a policy of reporting to the authorities. Where I believe the Duggars went wrong was they tried to handle this themselves. They tried to handle the issue in-house. And because they tried to handle it else, they made it worse. We can't afford to do this anymore. Churches, families, we have to take this seriously. The reputation of church has been hurt, I think justifiably, by our failure to respond in a positive way. But of course, the stakes are much deeper and much greater than reputation. We are talking about people's lives. Often, those who are victims in religious communities of sexual molestation are unable to have a relationship with God afterwards, if it's handled badly. There's a lot at stake here. The Duggars are a cautionary tale. Don't rely on the aura of Christian faith. Don't rely on the appearance of wholesomeness. All of us are struggling with something, and often there is something behind the scenes, something that we do not see, something that we do not understand. And so in times when we are faced with people who are experiencing these kinds of brokenness, our best response is to believe them. Our best response is to walk with them, to love them, to be there as they go through their own journey and process of healing. These are not easy things. But the question of sexual violence in church and religious organizations is something that we have to talk about. If you like Geek Cross, please help us out and leave us a review on iTunes. You can find Geek Cross on Facebook and Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @GeekCrossShow. You can email geekcross at geekcrossshow@gmail.com. Geek Cross is a McLaren production. My name is Jeremy Yoder. Thanks for listening.